Hi there everyone, today I'm reviewing The End and the Death, Volume 3 by Dan Abnett. So since Horus Rising was published in 2006, we've had 66 books, a host of short stories, audiobooks, novellas, compilations, and we're finally there at the end of the Horus Heresy. This is the final book in the Siege of Terror series, and it has a lot to live up to. But how good of a job does it do? Let's find out in this spoiler-filled review. So stop listening now if you don't want to hear spoilers. There's your warning. So yes, there's big moments in this book. There's not huge deviations from what we know necessarily about the background and lore. And it kind of generally makes for a fairly enjoyable read. The End and the Death Volume 3 is at times epic. At times makes you smirk. And at times reminds you to be angry at Erebus. The book does several things very well. This is Dan Abnett writing here, and as is typical, his descriptions and dialogue tend to be high quality. The dialogue is often laced with deeper meaning as well, references, or becomes more philosophical. I do think there's a refreshing freedom in this book, and like the author says in his afterword, he was kind of given more freedom with this one. Sometimes the message in the dialogue is wider than expected, such as a quotation which I'll share, speaking of the ethos of the Imperium moving forward. I open quote, "Words heal. You can close a wound with a good story and let it mend and make it better. Even when it's a lie?" asks Agafe. "Lies are more efficacious still," Moriana smiles. "A good lie is better than a bad truth. Their healing powers are miraculous. Tell a good story and you can restore things to the way they were. Tell a good lie and you can make them the way they should have been." End quote. And the approach that the Imperium takes in this way, where the Emperor's kind of hiding chaos from all of humanity at first, right? Or at least most of it. It's kind of tackled by other characters as well in this book. Was the Emperor correct in shielding humanity from the knowledge of chaos? Would things have turned out differently if he'd approached it differently? Or was his policy one that actually kind of meant they kind of survived up till now? Anyway, there's a host of events in this book I could cover, so I'm going to have to be selective. Old Person and John Grammaticus play a crucial role, getting the anathema weapon to the Emperor, who actually has to heal it first for them. Loken gets stabbed in the back, but it's a sad, but perhaps necessary in some ways, moment. It was probably time for Loken's story to end, to provide a sense of finality that is not present with many of the other threads throughout the Horus Heresy. And since it was done by Erebus, it's likely to intensify everyone's hatred for him too. It was a big moment that had the kind of impact I wish we'd seen more often throughout the series. The reaction of the Blood Angels in this book, with Azkaellon becoming essentially a beast, were some of the most effective sections of description and imagery in Volume 3. You really feel the bestial loss of their father and how close they are in falling to Khorne. Or there's the scenes with Sigismund escorting Keeler and being assisted by the Fallen. They're great scenes that have a great blend of action and interplay between characters. And of course we have to talk about the clash between Horus and the Emperor, with the duel actually being revisited repeatedly. In fact, Horus effectively beats the Emperor, I think it's like 3 to 5 times, as we return to the fight again and again. And it kind of ends with a sort of sense of a finish at the end of each of these little sections. And obviously it was expected that this would be a big part of this book, as everything's been building up to it. But the action and Horus's perspective, seeing things from, his first person perspective, make it work really well. And this approach helps us retain the mystery of seeing things from the Emperor's view, which has been very rarely done. Even, we have a custodian speaking for the Emperor, I think in volumes 2 and 3. And it's quite clever because it avoids the mystique behind the Emperor being revealed too much. Although some might feel that actually it would have been pretty cool to have a big portion of this book from the Emperor's perspective, but it kind of helps him retain that kind of mythical status of godhood. And also, the advantage of seeing things from Horus's perspective is it adds further depth to his, we know he's ambitious, we know he's power hungry, and he has a lot of hubris. But at the end, he kind of has a bit of regret, obviously, which adds depth to his character. Probably makes a lot of people a bit more sympathetic towards him. As for the final confrontation, Loken does show up. He was obviously such a pivotal character in Horus Rising, the very first book. Some of the dialogue with Loken and Horus is great. The son reunited with his traitorous father. And Loken tries to persuade Horus to turn back, show his heart, and that he should prove that he succeeded as Horus Lupercal, rather than a pawn of the Chaos Gods. And it's quite a compelling argument. Horus at last admits that he doesn't want to remain on the path he's going, so there's obviously a bit of contrition there. But it turns out Loken was actually an illusion that the Emperor uses. And so they then resume fighting, and Horus eventually tells the Emperor to kill him rather than let him become a puppet for Chaos. And at the very last instance, the Emperor forgives Horus before running him through with the anathema. So that's really the kind of end conclusion to what happens. I think the Dark King thread that we saw in volumes 1 and 2 didn't really get much or any attention in volume 3, which was a little strange, but parallels were drawn between Horus and the Emperor, especially the accusation that Chaos was just trying to use everyone, and that actually Horus levels the same accusation at the Emperor that he was just trying to use everyone. But the kind of illusion of Loken, I think says, I was his to use. In the aftermath, one scene turns to Abaddon and his plan to go on without Horus. And he has this kind of confrontation with Loken, but this time the real one, not an illusion now. And there is somewhat of a reconciliation between the two. They agree not to fight for now, but if they see each other again, it becomes clear that they will. It makes a lot of sense that Abaddon is kind of focused on a bit here because he's obviously the figurehead for 40k Chaos Forces. Yet a few question marks still remain from the reading of this book. It doesn't actually detail what necessarily happens to the Vengeful Spirit. But perhaps this was intentional, as we know Abaddon makes it into the 41st millennium, so perhaps it's a bit unnecessary to actually elaborate on that. At one point, it is said that if a third more of the Loyalists had survived, they could have wiped out the traitors. And I found this a lazy phrase. Presumably, it's essentially to suggest that they could have totally won had the Space Wolves, Ultramarines, and any other remaining forces made it to Terra in time. But saying it in this way doesn't really add gravitas, and it also seems counter to the repeated descriptions in the lead-up. We've seen that the Chaos Forces are of such a massive size, like it's beyond belief. So, you could say that, well, they're obviously attacking Terra. It's like the most heavily defended place in the Imperium. Of course, they lost a lot. But it sort of diminishes that impact given this statement. It's like, oh, if they had a third more, they would have been fine. I don't know. I don't think it really added to the tension. It sort of seemed a throwaway remark, and it just didn't feel thought through to me. But usually there are turns of phrase that are clever and impactful, which is more what I expect from Dan Abnett. And many of them may go unnoticed. There's a little line about the bitter, vengeful spirit where it wasn't actually talking about the ship, I don't think. I think it was actually describing Horus, perhaps. And then obviously his ship is called Vengeful Spirit. There's the reference to the High Priest from Ian Watson's Inquisition War. And I think because of these little references, it's a kind of book that you probably could reread, actually, to try and think more carefully about everything and sort of digest it. I still feel like Dan Abnett was the right man for the job. It's kind of this cool feeling where he started off this huge series with so many books and then he finished it as well. It's very fitting. And at times it really pays dividends on how the action or descriptions are delivered, like I mentioned earlier. Most people's interpretation of the quality of this book then will be based on whether they thought there was enough payoff relative to the length. This was the shortest book in the trilogy of The End and the Death volumes, and the audiobook still clocked in at over 15 hours, so it's still pretty substantial. The trilogy is, of course, essentially supposed to be a single book, and I think especially in volume 2 there just wasn't enough payoff for the amount of pages there. This third volume arguably plays it fairly safe in terms of the story. It's hardly a surprise that Ol and John Grammaticus play a pivotal role in the Emperor killing Horus. I think everyone expected that. Perhaps the best example is the Terminus Decree, where obviously the weapon that Basilio Foe created is going to be used to basically sort of wipe out everyone if it looks like Chaos is going to win. Aemon Taromachian eventually sanctions its use in this book, but is actually told to hold off at the last minute. And again, it's not surprising because obviously if they use the weapon, it's going to kill everyone. But it took so much development in the prior books, and there wasn't really that much payoff, I don't think. You've obviously got references to the Terminus Decree, and I think Grey Knight's codexes usually have it. But I don't know, it seemed like a lot of groundwork, and then it's just like, okay, we're going to fire it. Oh no, we're not. So, my criticism is not that it should have been used, but maybe the way the kind of plot unravels around it, etc., it's kind of has more impact on other aspects. Like maybe, I don't know, some faction it has to kind of rush to try and stop the weapon being fired. There could be tension with that or something, and then something comes out of being used, the weapon partially or something. There's plenty you could do with it, I think. But again, it's one of those threads where it kind of, there's a lot of build-up and then not much really happens. Conversely, though, some threads in prior books go missing in this one, and this was kind of the last opportunity for them to get wrapped up. So I think a lot of people will read this thinking, oh, what happened with this character? And then expecting them to turn up, and then there's nothing in here about them. We don't really know what happens to the Alpha Legion, who had some interesting sections so far in The End and the Death trilogy. In the prior books, there's some really cool sections, such as Ingo Pesh, for example. But the loose threads perhaps make it likely that there is still more to come, or was there just a decision that leaving some inferences and questions to be used, and maybe they'll get developed in 40k, was the kind of intention. But, there's Bartuza Narek, the word-bearer sniper, and, he's sort of just waiting for Lorgar, and I don't think anything's happened with that, if I recall correctly. So I would say that I think this is hardly the end of the Horus Heresy books, personally. I think maybe it'll go to the Scouring, so it sort of develops into that. Maybe there's a kind of new series that, I don't know, goes earlier or something. I doubt that, probably, but there's a few ways they could take it. I just think that if it makes money, why would you just stop everything? We'll see. Maybe I'm wrong. There has been a delicate dance to this series, though, with so many different characters and factions and favoured figures. Sometimes I thought the Horus Heresy spread itself too thinly, and at other times introduces characters that have a lot of time spent on them for little payoff, and I think we kind of saw this a lot with The End of the Death. I think that's my main criticism of the end 3 volumes. And in this book, it's kind of a mixture, to be honest. Some sections and characters stay with you, Loken and Abaddon, Erebus, Azkalon, and the Blood Angels, and of course Horus and the Emperor. But others play bit-part roles, Vulcan, Kirill Sinderman. And it feels frustrating to me that some threads are almost neglected, and they had, so much room to play with. Abnett was given license to have 3 volumes to write about it, and I think it still could have been a lot more focused around some of the central characters. It would have been quite cool, actually, to have every thread kind of tied up and have multiple plot arcs, within the palace, and as the end kind of comes to a wrap, okay, you might have to retcon some things, but I think it could have been done in a way where it doesn't affect the core events. Because in this book, a lot of the core events still happen, but they kind of happen broadly as you'd expect, really. So in terms of final score, to reach the conclusion, The End and the Death Volume 3 is a solid end to this massive series that we've all enjoyed. but I thought it could have had a little more impact. There are plenty of clever turns of phrase and allusions and references, but sometimes I wonder if the central themes and characters could have their events fleshed out more at the expense of sections that feel extraneous. In hindsight, I perhaps reviewed Volume 2 a little generously. As before I actually started Volume 3, I was kind of thinking about it, and I was kind of like, I think Volume 2 had a lot of filler content, and maybe it did deserve a lower rating. But anyway, despite these flaws, the final battle in this book was as epic as I had hoped. The grief of the Blood Angels, the shock of Loken's ending, Ol's sacrifice and Abaddon's escaping to continue to wage war in the 41st millennium. I'm glad they didn't change a lot of those central elements. It's been a hugely enjoyable series for many years of reading. I think, 18 years of reading, it's kind of crazy, really, if you've read pretty much every book like myself. And at least the end didn't have a gigantic retcon that kind of ruined things and left everyone hating it. I think, in a way, I'm kind of glad they played it slightly safe, I guess. In conclusion, it's a decent but slightly muted end to a huge and epic series, but it is a good read. It's hard to deny. It was enjoyable to read it. You want to find out what happens. So I'm giving this one a 7 out of 10. It's a solid end to what has been a fantastic series, in my opinion. There's been highs and lows, obviously, with so many books, but, it's pretty cool. So thanks for watching. I'll be reviewing plenty more Warhammer books on this channel. So like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.